Welcome everybody to a very exciting and highly anticipated panel called Evaluation, How Much Evaluation is Enough? This panel will feature Chen, David Ebert, Brian Fisher. I'm the organizer, and Tamara Munzner. So anybody that's been in the VIS business has spent a lot of time and energy sort of wondering and thinking about evaluation. Yeah, and what it boils down to in this panel, we're going to talk about sort of what is the right amount of energy to invest in evaluation. So we can all agree that evaluation is absolutely a critical component of all of our paper writing and paper submissions, but it's complicated. So there are lots of different ways to evaluate a paper or contribution. We can evaluate based on, say, performance time or memory requirements. There are also human-centered types of evaluations, things like user studies. We can also evaluate papers based on, say, domain expert feedback, right? The review process itself is a type of evaluation, so when we're actually reviewing a paper, we're performing some sort of evaluation or a meta-evaluation, if you will, about the contribution inside. And maybe a lot of us have had the experience that we go through some sort of evaluation process, we submit our paper, and the reviewers decide that the evaluation is not adequate, right? For one reason or another. Maybe it's not the right type of evaluation, maybe it's not in-depth enough, it's too tertiary, and then we don't get to present our amazing papers at all of our favorite venues. So we're going to discuss this great topic, and we're going to find out if there's we can get some consensus, learn some new things about evaluation. Is there any consensus on what constitutes an adequate or appropriate evaluation? And just personally, I get this personal feeling that this is a really hot topic this year. I've had a lot of people just come up to me unsolicited and start talking to me about evaluation, and how there's a little bit of dissatisfaction, like a dissatisfaction vibe on the evaluation topic inside some of the circles at VIS and EuroVis. So we're going to look at some questions, address some questions. What is the most appropriate way to evaluate a visualization? To what extent should a piece of visualization work be evaluated prior to publication? When presenting a new visualization approach, what proportion of a paper should be dedicated to the evaluation? Does evaluation have to be the last phase of a waterfall model for visualization? What are the critical elements, and what constitutes a convincing evaluation? When is a user study an appropriate form of evaluation? And how much responsibility, one of my favorite questions, how much responsibility lies with the reviewers to evaluate some visualization work? So each panelist will have 5 to 15 minutes to present some position statements, and that will leave about 30 to 35 minutes for an interactive discussion with participation from the audience. And then at the end, we'll wrap it up with a 1 to 2 minute sort of concluding statement from each panelist. And we thought we would do the panelists in alphabetical order by surname. So Chen, David Ebert, Brian Fisher, and Tamara Munzner. But before we start the lively discussion, I have a public service announcement. We have a very, very exciting event coming up next year called EuroVis 2014 in Swansea, Wales, and it's going to be really exciting. We have a full paper track, a short paper track, a workshops call for participation, and survey papers for the first time at EuroVis. So it's going to be really, really exciting. We also have maybe some surprise sheep shearing event, maybe. It's work in progress. Okay, so let's stop with the advertising, and we're going to hand the microphone over to Professor Min Chen.
Number 3. Hello, and thank you very much, Bob. And really, I've been thinking about this evaluation question for a very long time, particularly since I was co-chair for IEEE VIS, papers co-chair in IEEE VIS back in 2007 and 2008. We will be giving the same question by the reviewers about how much evaluation is really enough. And as a co-chair, so you find actually the question is quite difficult to answer to the reviewers when it comes to those kind of questions. And since then, and being involving TVCG editorial boards and various other the IPC or the co-chair and activities, then we always had this question. And sometimes you see the errors or mistakes were made in judgment, but I didn't know how to do it. And so my title is kind of reflect my thinking. On one hand, I didn't really want to criticize the reviewers because they are really all volunteer their effort. They statistically are doing a great job. And but at the same time, then in some way, I also have a feel for as a community, we probably need to move forward. So part of my talk is trying to capture this feeling is how to move the community forward. So the word evaluation has many, many different meanings. And so there's a wide interpretation of evaluation and as well as a narrow interpretation of evaluation. The narrow one, which you see on the right, is largely being interpreted as a usability. And the wide one is we really evaluate everything in terms of originality and the rigor and the significance. I use these 3 terms because they were used in the UK research assessment exercises for ranking papers, published works in that way for the last 20 odd years. And so that particular 3 concepts was reasonably good in capture the quality of a piece of research work should be. And in terms of methodology, how many ways you can evaluate the originality and the rigor and the significance. And of course, the most important one from my point of view and the experience is really the peer judgment. And academics as a reviewers, we normally are the experts on the topic, and we should largely look at the paper, be able to establish whether they are original or rigor or significant. And we don't always require the user, we don't always require the author to particularly show the evidence, because sometimes we can work out a fair amount of evidence ourselves. And in particular, we assess their originality and the rigor and the significance against the prior work, the previous work in the literature, whether it's a fundamental theory or was an algorithm or was an experimental results, and many other things we can actually look into how they are related to the prior, previous work and what's the distance from the new work and so on. And of course, it is the author's job to provide the evidence to say this is original and this is rigor and this is significant in some way. And there are many ways you can provide the evidence: mathematical reasoning, the developing software engineering department, those are evidence, and the experimental design and exclusion and analysis, particularly in relation to the usability style for the study and so on. And the significance, in fact, is the one most difficult to evaluate. And so, in my view, some of the discussion in terms of a short-term speculative saying, and that might be some kind of applications in the future and so on, and that could also potentially be considered acceptable for people. The work is very original, maybe very theoretical. And the usability study is a kind of a medium term and an activity you can use for evaluate the rigor aspect of that. And And there are other long-term ones, for example, comprehensive survey and so on. So if we took the evaluation in that two different aspects, one is really, really wide interpretation and one is narrow interpretation, what I notice is people's tendency is to use the one interpretation, for example, use the narrow interpretation to imply the wide interpretation, and that become quite a danger in the way to look into the work in some way. And why I mentioned the previous work is really important because all evaluation methods rely on a very good knowledge about the previous work. So let me chipping in my public service announcements, and there is a community resources, and there is a new project that's just being set up, and we're looking for volunteers to curate records of references and in visualization. The idea is we can organize the visualization references in a structured way, such as taxonomy, and we need many people as curators to help build this particular knowledge and to be shared by the community. And I'll finish my announcement for the time being. And so let's back to the evaluation, the wide interpretation and the narrow interpretation. And of course, ideally, we would like all the paper have a perfect originality and a perfect rigor and a perfect significance. But in reality, you're not going to get that very often. You very rarely get one really, really top sort of paper meets everything. So sometimes we have a paper very original, but not very rigor, and possibly we don't know whether they are significant or not, and for the time being. And sometimes we have a paper, for example, application paper, they may come in with a really exciting application and they never really happened before, and the work is really good, but they may algorithmic techniques involved, they are not original. Rigor, it's very difficult to do with application papers quite often to really working on that, so we may have this kind of style. And in some other cases, we really conduct a piece of usability study in a very rigorous sort of a way, like a psychologist normally will be required to do, with controlled, very well designed controlled experiment, and minimize the confounding effects and do the ANOVA analysis, and so we can have a very, very rigorous process. But if you're thinking that the narrow evaluation interpretation tend to imply the rigor part, so we're largely there to evaluate the rigor, while the broad interpretation is much more concentrated on or emphasis on originality and significance. So as someone slightly sort of older got white hairs, and so I can't sort of help try to thinking some paper really influenced me greatly in my career. And the three papers which I highlight here give me really a lot of directions in early days, which is Bill Rawlinson's Marching Cubes paper and the Mark Lavoie's paper, and on the raycasting for volume rendering, and the Ben Schneider's tree map paper, and they were published in the late 80s and early 90s, that time period. Then I always ask my question, can they pass the reviewers today? Are they rigor enough? Do they have a usability studies? Do they indicate they have a good application users? Are they mathematically really proven everything sort of error-free? They probably wouldn't. They might get rejected quite easily today. Is it a good thing or bad thing? And that is the question. Somehow it sort of puzzles me, and in some way, and I would like to see under those work, and even they contain some shortcomings, and that they still be able to get into our literature and really influence a lot of people in their research and in a gigantic way. So those are the ones I really admired and inspired me, and I wish we have more papers like that and in our field. And even when we talk about the evaluation involving the controlled user studies, they're not always, in my view, are usability studies. They're not necessarily fitting to the narrow term of evaluation. And I've always asked why psychologists don't call their studies evaluation, why sociologists don't call their studies evaluation. They just call them empirical studies, whether it's controlled user studies or whether it's focus group studies. And why? and because the purpose, it was not an inward looking at evaluating this piece of work is good enough for publication or not. They're outward looking to say, let's make a new discovery, let's make a new science. So I actually talking to a few colleagues, I said I really would like the category of evaluation in the VIS review system or paper system be renamed as empirical studies. And the evaluation kind of forced to thinking something inwards and a little bit narrow-minded rather than a bit more ambitious to say, let's find what really visualization works, why it works. And the psychologists on this panel, we have a Brian here, but we don't have that many Brians in our community. We have to work on it ourselves as a visualization committee. We have to make those discoveries. So I'm sure Brian is going to tell us a bit more about that later on in his talk. And also even in a practical project, and the process of evaluation is often an iterative process. As Tamara very well and presented in her paper about the agile model and Tamara called nested model. And unfortunately, if you conduct your work in evaluation, including development, design, evaluation, whatever, in a kind of a nested model, and when you write it up in a paper, it looks sort of a kind of a stir fry and a really sort of a terrible looking as a paper. And the reviewers really prefer to see something like a waterfall model. You do the design requirement analysis first, then you do the design, then you do the implementation, then you finish it, you do a study, box tick, the whole process done, great. And so that means we actually kind of have a massage our practice to represent it, to make it into like a waterfall model, and whether this is desirable or not. And I hope Tamara may shed some light on that. Another thing is when we talk about evaluation, quite often, and everyone said evaluation is about evaluate insight gained from visualization. And I often working with domain experts on that. Actually, they always feel intimidated the moment he asks, say, what insight did you gain from the visualization? They always feel like we try to take credit for their clever discoveries. And they sort of always choked. Almost every time you ask that question, they choke. They say, well, talk about insight. And so, in fact, if you're looking carefully, and the insight is very, very difficult to measure because you require a lot of domain knowledge to gain insight. It's not a visualization offers insight, and the visualization just presents the information in a slightly different way. And so what visualization really helps, a lot of cases making observation, just allow people to make observation in a different way. And facilitating external memorization, and so people don't need to remember things so often, they just have a glance of the paper, they find things. Stimulating hypothesis, it's they're getting close to the insight aspect. Evaluating hypothesis in an ad hoc way, because if I want to roughly know how many people here, and I just have a quick look, I may think there's not many people, but I look around and say, oh, there are quite a lot of people. So I confirm my hypothesis was wrong. So those are the things you can quite easily evaluate in an ad hoc way. And of course, there's a larger group of people would rely on visualization to disseminate knowledge as well. So those are also another important element. And in some way, actually, I find saving time is better a kind of a way to sort of really emphasize what the visualization is for. But that's my personal opinion. And I know it's quite sort of questionable or debatable. And that's why I wrote something and put it on the archive and just say, let's just expose the concept, expose the thinking, and it may not be correct, it may not be agreeable. Certainly it's not quite consistent with the traditional interpretation of what visualization is for gaining insight. Okay, evaluation is also a long-term process, and the independent objective evaluation really takes a long time to gain. And but a narrow interpretation would require a waterfall model, very short-term, quite often self-certified kind of process procedures. And we normally encourage a positive conclusion. If you do a study, the conclusion is negative, essentially you're done. So the paper, don't bother. And so, in some way, and if you look in the history, some of our visual a good evaluation, let's call them evaluation or empirical studies. For example, David Ledlow's work on comparing the flow, a few vector field visualization methods. And it was done in 2005. The method, the latest method in his evaluation was published in 1993. So it took 12 years to get a good evaluation out. If you take the second example, for example, and Caroline and Robert's paper and on the visual metaphor, actually is really about studying the hierarchical tree map and the tree visualization. And if you compare the time when Ben Schneiderman invented the tree map, which is 1992, and you can work out how many years later. So it's a long term. So in some way, why so rush? We have to make a concluding remarks on a visual design must be good today. And why can't we wait another 10 years, 20 years, let people to judge it in the future? So the bigger evaluation or the wider evaluation does not equal to the narrow evaluation. You probably agree with me. Then what I would like to is encourage more bigger evaluation and perhaps demand less the narrow evaluation. That's my talk.
Next, we'll have David Ebert.
I didn't know we were having ads in here, so I apologize that mine doesn't look quite as good as the others, but I figured I had to start off to say, if you are looking for a faculty position, or you are looking for a postdoc, since I'm not hosting a conference anytime soon, please contact me. But anyway, I guess I think you'll find there's a lot of commonality among everything that we all say here, because while we sometimes get caught up in minor things, I think we're in quite a lot of agreement in what we're talking about. And the question is, what should we really be doing for evaluation? You know, I mean, just how quickly, when do you do the evaluation, what's the value of the evaluation, and how much should we have, sort of looking at what Min was saying. You know, I think that some of this stuff is easier to judge than others, and I think the significance is really an interesting thing. And I sort of view that hopefully if we have a peer review process, this is the whole purpose of the peer review process for the paper, and this is a continuum that people can judge. And significance, a lot of conferences have started doing the test of time award. What is the best paper from N-10 years that's had the most impact? And that's really a good way to judge the significance of a result. It's not always obvious to people when you have what you think is a brilliant insight that it's going to have the impact that you think it's going to have. So it becomes quite hard to judge in a lot of ways. So how much evaluation should we have? I've definitely looked at some papers and thought that they did not show the value of the paper and sort of criticized them for not having enough evaluation, whether it's timing information, comparison to previous techniques, user studies. I've also criticized ones that have spent too much time on that and not enough describing what their technique actually is. So with a lot of things, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder sometimes in terms of doing this. So I don't think one size fits every situation. And I think that the community has grown in seeing the value of empirical studies and in ways of evaluating things. Sometimes I agree that this has been taken a little bit too far in asking for this. And so I think there's a lot of problems in doing this. And the biggest issue that I have is someone says, well, you haven't done a large enough user study in what you're doing. A lot of times, as people are doing work to solve real-world problems, there's a small community that you're working with. As an example, we developed a tool for the Vice Admiral in charge of the Atlantic Command of the U.S. Coast Guard. There's him and his counterpart in charge of the Pacific Command. Now, is this helping him become more effective as a decision maker and making strategic risk-based decisions? getting undergrads in my lab to sit down and use the software for 2 hours really won't judge whether or not the tool that I've developed is effective, because they don't have 25 years of experience in the type of decision making that's going on. So there are some things you can judge easily and some things you can't. So I really think effectiveness and usefulness, the significance portion that Min's talking about, is oftentimes what people are looking for when they ask for user studies and they're asking for evaluation. And it isn't always people don't always respond with the right way of doing that. And they also don't understand the issues in doing good empirical studies and not having confounding factors in it. And oftentimes the approach that they're taking to try to judge things is not the right approach. Or in an interesting discipline, you could say, is this data-driven science? What are the appropriate techniques that we should be applied? And it really depends on the type of factor that you're actually trying to judge. And so different types of evaluation and empirical studies can be used to judge different things, even different components in a given system and project that someone's working on. So I think traditional user studies that people try to apply to some of the complicated situations that we're developing tools to help solve are not always effective, and the toy tasks on small domain problems don't really show whether they'll help someone be effective and efficient in doing their job. And so I think what's really needed is that you work and customize the evaluation that you do in the beginning. If we're really talking about, is this technique that has significance in making a contribution to the field, reviewers can oftentimes look at the state of the art and judge that. If you're saying, is this an application that someone's shown success, that it has actually solved a problem, that becomes much harder to judge. And we really need to look at things from the low level of the efficiency and accuracy of the technique that you're developing. There's also different evaluation for usability, and up to, is it really effective in doing the job? So I think we need, of course, to start with this from the beginning. And if you're talking about end user community, you need to have them involved from the beginning. They need to be involved as you continuously refine this, and that you can show the effectiveness of what you're doing with ever doing a traditional user study. And so without getting statistical significance, because it can be very hard to get statistical significance in some areas. And Brian will talk about methods where in the social sciences and psychology where people are coming up with different ways to give you different methods to actually evaluate this. And so my takeaways from this is, I think it's fine to have publications without user studies. I think that sometimes they can even be better because you have more space to describe the system. And I think that actually a method that works in a lot of fields is you publish a technique and then you publish studies showing the evaluation of that afterwards. And I don't know why that isn't a model that some of the people in our community think it has to be all in one. And it means that you have a very dense publication and very succinct without enough detail sometimes for a different area, which is the reproducibility of what you're doing. So I would actually say that doing 2 good publications out of it instead of 1 make much more sense. So, thank you.
Next, we'll have Brian Fisher.
Thank you. As some of you know, I'm not a stranger to this community. I've held a double life for the past about 20 years. On one hand, I still go to the Cognitive Science Society. I present there. I publish in their literature. My doctorate was in experimental psychology. But I've been a member of this community, especially the VAS community, for a long time, longer than I care to think. They gave me a pioneer badge this year, so it's a really long time. And so I'm giving this position paper from that kind of dual perspective. So in experimental psychology or in cognitive science, there's a perspective called distributed cognition, and there's a bunch of kinds of decog. I won't go into them all today, but one of them is the idea that cognition can be distributed among people and they can coordinate their actions. Ed Hutchins had a classic book, Cognition in the Wild, where he talks about this at a Navy ship. So one perspective on evaluation is to evaluate the situation in which analysis takes place with an eye towards building an underlying analytics, which is a process that is truth-preserving from the position of someone in the business world. It's a warrant to believe that if you have this skilled visual analyst, you give them this proper software, and you have them work on your data set, their conclusions are things that you can spend money on. They're policy decisions that have to be made, and there needs to be an argument made for this person. And so for this perspective, we have to expand our view and evaluate analysis in the wild. Much of this perspective came about when the Boeing company showed up with money, problems, and data. So I blame Dave Kasich for a lot of this. What we do is we show up. We put students that are trained in visual analytics, in being an analyst, into the Boeing company. They get hired, they're interns, sometimes they're employees, and they live with those people and they work on their problems, and we capture that whole process. The term Hutchins uses cognitive ethnography. So it's this very rich, thick description, but it's an eye towards pulling that underlying analytics out. We've done that as well in emergency management. My postdoc trained as emergency manager at the Justice Institute of BC. He trained at the City of Richmond. He participates in exercise. So we just move in with them. Healthcare monitoring and management, we've done the same thing in public health projects that are building technology that's being used across BC now to prevent and respond to injuries to children. So the goal of this kind of process is to define an analytics, which is not the analysis, it's the underlying structure of the visual analysis that makes it truth-preserving or truth-producing, and that acts as a warrant for the decision makers to base policy upon. So this analysis in the wild approach. Another, stepping away from that approach that I've been doing for many years, draws more from classic experimental psychology. We're looking now at how cognition can be distributed between a human being and a technological support. So having just a typology for a problem, a mathematical donation, Feynman diagrams in physics, allow someone who is very knowledgeable to look at those, understand the situation, and project the next step so that they can continue with a proof or something of the sort. So we can, even a static representation can act as a catalyst for cognitive processing, can shape that process. When you build a richly interactive system that supports a cognitive activity, such as the fishtank VR approach to air traffic control, then you create a situation, a perceptual situation that is unlike anything that we encounter in day-to-day life. And so the question is, will this kind of perceptual situation interact with human cognitive architecture, just the way the brain is built to process the visual world in this case, in such a way that air traffic controllers don't make mistakes? Now, we could run this in user testing, but if we did classic user testing, we have to run it until we get errors, and the acceptable error rate in air traffic control is 0. So we'll never get enough of a main effect that we can find a difference between two conditions. We certainly would never get enough for an interaction, so you can't test it with classic HCI methods when you have to test down to an error rate of 0. So this work actually, going back in time, was the first InfoBiz paper I had with John Dill in the late 90s, and it continued with a bunch of psychology colleagues at UBC. And what you get from this flavor of study is you get a toy world, but it's a toy world that's based on the interaction between the graphical environments we create and human capabilities of perceptual and cognitive processing. The study methods look a lot like experimental psychology, but it's nothing an experimental psychologist would do because they don't care about these environments. It's not in their world. And so you run a toy world, you're asked to keep track of the ones that have red circles around them. They move around rather erratically. The fish tank VR environment is doing a lot of camera movements, a lot of zooms, and sometimes we tilt it in 3 space in the Z-axis. And then you're asked whether that's one of yours. So this is the moral equivalent of increasing the dose of artificial sweetener on a mouse or rat to see whether it gets cancer. We're really pushing the cognitive architecture. And you get these lovely psychophysical functions, and you can model these computationally and mathematically, and I've been doing that work. I started doing that work back at the University of California as a graduate student. So David talks about t-tests and statistical differences as being limiting. One can build computational models of mind, Alan Newell's phrase, that can capture these regularities and be much more predictive. So that's what we try to do. And underneath this is a theory that I don't have time to go into from human psychology, the Finst hypothesis of attentional tokens. And that it underlies subitizing and underlies Gestalt grouping principle. It's a very important kind of a method. So you've got these two extremes. This one evaluation of effectively an operational process or a business process that includes technology and integrates technology, and we get this rich, thick description out of it. That's akin to what Ben Snyderman talks about when he talks about Science 2.0. But I'm not ready to give up on Science 1.0. It was really useful when we had to cure polio. It's still very handy. And so we do the Science 1.0 as well. And what's missing, and I think David alluded a bit to that in his talk, is that bridge. So a lot of the emphasis now is on how we can build a bridge between these rich descriptions that we get from the ethnography and these very theory testing, empirical, natural sciences model studies that we do in the lab. And the model that we've taken, the approach we've taken to that takes a rich description and creates a quasi-experiment or field experiment. So we artificially divide the analytic task into a student analyst and into a Boeing safety subject matter expert. We have them work together. We capture their discourse. We capture their screen movements. We capture how they use the technologies. We're getting HCI data, and we're getting the rich linguistic, psycholinguistic description that they have. And we use a framework from Herbert H. Clarke, a theory of joint activity. And we're advancing joint activity to bridge to the way the technology operates, so to give us a path from the business process to the laboratory. So this is this very big tent view of evaluation. We evaluate business processes. We evaluate, the human interaction with interactive technology from a perspective in cognitive architecture. And so it's very much a big tent. Now, where would I like to see it go, or where do I think it should go? Well, what you'd like to have happen is through this kind of process, we reach out into these other disciplines and we begin to change the way they do behaviors. And people in the Cognitive Science Society will claim that that's really what the Cognitive Science Society has done. They've got their own journals and their own conference, but they've changed the way experimental psychology works because they provided a place where experimental psychologists could run into neuroscientists, sociologists, linguists, philosophers, and AI modelers of human cognition. So you'd love to see this broad-based connection between the fields. And so this is my research utopia, where everyone finds a way to work together. And the question we have is, how much of this can we do at VIS? VAST has come a long way with these case studies. There's a lot of cognition in the wild. Maybe it's not as methodologically rich as it would be if there were more, cog-sci, decog people here. InfoVis has an awful lot of perceptual psychology. I'm seeing some nice perceptual cognition studies. Just today at InfoVis, there were some great papers. And so they're moving into that space. And again, they don't have the methodological sophistication necessarily that the experimental psychologists do, although I will say the papers I saw today were actually very well done, and one of them was done by a fellow who is an experimental psychologist by training, who's now also come over into this world. But if we can't do them all here, how do we support and facilitate people to do these studies elsewhere so that we can use the knowledge they produce? How do we build a meeting ground at Chinook, a trade language that lets us work with them? And is there an organization that coordinates the whole process? Is it something that VIS does? Is it something, do we need a computational cognitive science society equivalent that does this? At your university, does it happen in an institute that tries to bring all these people in and under one big banner and builds a building and gives them jobs so the psychologists don't fear that they'll lose their chance of getting a tenure track position, very competitive because they're tainted by computer scientists, as I had been accused for many years of being tainted. And now I will conclude, amongst all these probably unanswerable questions, with my ad, since it seems like it's all the rage. We do have a Tier 1 research chair for a senior scholar position that's open at SFU, and please talk to me or John or any of our other SFU colleagues about it.
Last but not least, we have Tamara Munzner.
Hi, thanks. So, always both good and bad to go last. Of course, it's not last because there'll be a bunch of discussion afterwards, but let me attack this question with thinking about when and how to evaluate. So, this is a question that I've wrestled with a lot, and I suspect many people have. And so, certainly in private, I wrestle with it all the time, and wearing at least two different hats, where for each basis, I sit around and wonder, as an author, how should I evaluate this project as we sit down to write a paper? And then, of course, as a reviewer, I wrestle with, do I believe that a particular paper I'm reading has done a good enough job of evaluation that I think it should be accepted? What I've also done is something slightly more unusual, which is that I've made statements about this in a very public context of having this series of what I'll call meta papers, which are giving a fair amount of prescriptive advice about what I think both authors and reviewers might want to think about. This is, of course, sometimes a very dangerous thing to do. To quote Lewis Carroll, she generally gave herself very good advice, though she very seldom followed it. So it's not by saying, I don't think I have always done everything correctly. In fact, I know for a fact I have not. I even sometimes manage to violate my own advice in later projects, not necessarily on purpose. Having said that, I still then try to think, all right, what are some ways that we could as a community think about how to evaluate? So this series of 4 meta papers, there was one a while back about process and pitfalls that actually grew out of a Dogstool workshop that's linked to in the call for papers for several of the conferences now. A paper a few years ago on a nested model of design and validation I'll talk about a bit just because it's so much helped frame my own thoughts. We've got some follow-on stuff that we presented at the Believe workshop, and now there's a journal version on that coming out soon. And then there was a paper last year about the methodology of design studies, and these all kind of weighed in with some prescriptive advice about what to do. Now, in contrast to a lot of what Min and David talked about, which were fairly focused on the reviewer perspective, these are a bit more focused on the author point of view, in terms of how could an author try to convince. So I think that it can be a little dangerous to just count on the reader, whether that's the reviewer or the later reader of the paper, to kind of fill in all the blanks. And I think it can also often be a good idea for the author to explicitly construct the arguments about why should you believe that this particular paper is a contribution. So, because often as the author, you've got all the pieces together in your head, whereas a reader might be coming from a very, very different perspective. So also, like Min, I definitely want to think about evaluation as being a very broad term. And in the nested model paper, I specifically talk about evaluation where I use this word kind of as a synonym, evaluation, validation, but where again, it's this very, very broad, so fat fonts way of thinking about evaluation. The way I've tended to think about this is by splitting up the design problem into different levels, we can actually try to match up the evaluation techniques with the level. So just for those who might not know this, the problem domain, in terms of my thinking about it, the problem domain is, here's what the domain experts are thinking about. They're using domain-specific language for both their tasks and their data. And then, of course, one way to validate whether you actually understand their problem is to see what they're doing before you intervene with a visualization system. So actually doing these kinds of observational field studies, often qualitative, with observing them with their existing workflows. Then the next level down is where you go from something problem-specific, domain-specific, to something that's more generic, that in the language of visualization, you can think about abstractions for both data and tasks. These can be sort of tricky to validate immediately. So part of the argument in this model is to think about going through these levels of design and then what kinds of evaluations are typically done more downstream after you've filled in some of these intermediate levels. So jumping down to the next level, there's designing what kind of picture are you actually drawing. So how do you draw the picture, visual encoding techniques, and how do you manipulate that picture, interaction techniques. And one way to validate right away is to actually have a discussion in the paper about why did I design it this way with respect to alternatives that I could have done differently. And then finally, I think it's useful to separate out the algorithmic issues of, is my code fast enough? And then, of course, everyone that's trained as a computer scientist is pretty familiar with evaluation techniques of measuring system time and benchmarks. There's a lot of issues there with, do you have appropriate benchmarks? Are your data sets actually broad enough, or are you cherry picking? But these questions of algorithmic benchmarks and computational complexity are maybe the best studied in computer science curricula, where a lot of people are actually trained in doing that. Some of these other methods are a little trickier because a lot of us are not necessarily trained in those methods. So I think there is still a lot of complexity in getting system evaluations right. There's a lot of ways to mess up your benchmarks. But as a community, we're a little better suited for doing that typically. And then to talk about some more evaluation methods, you can also analyze your results qualitatively. But coming back to a theme that's coming up in all of our talks, where does the user study fit in? I would argue that at this level of seeing whether or not you've designed an appropriate encoding and interaction technique, this is the place where user studies shine. That is, you're measuring some kind of human time and error with a controlled experiment in the lab. Then going back to the data and task abstraction level, if you're trying to figure out if you've actually got their task abstraction right, this is a great place for a field study. So going back to what Brian said about in the wild, to actually deploy the tool and then go watch your target users use it. Very important that it's the target users as opposed to undergraduates in the lab. And then finally, another thing to think about is, after you've released it, are people actually using it? That's another signal to tell whether you've succeeded. Now, one of the things I argue in the nested model paper is that a frequent source of problems for authors are mismatches, where they use the wrong validation technique to try to back up their primary contribution. So I typically argue that if you're trying to show how great your new visual encoding technique is, don't try to prove that with a benchmark about how fast your code runs. These are separable questions. And likewise, if you're trying to prove that you got the task abstraction right, that you figured out what the domain scientist needs, then a lab study is not going to be convincing evidence for that, because in those lab studies, you are telling the user what abstract has to use, rather than figuring out whether that abstraction is the right thing. So then this question of when do we evaluate? Well, going back to Lewis Carroll, let's see if this sheds any light on the subject. Begin at the beginning and go on till you come to the end, then stop. Well, no, that doesn't help. So what's the beginning? What's the end? When are we done even? When is a project finished? So I'd argue that at least at the high level, it's useful to think about two very different flavors, and in the HCI literature, these are typically called summative. At the end, do you want to convince me that you did the right thing? So as opposed to formative, which is as you go, are you going to evaluate to help you, the developer, the designer, make it better? And so I think it's useful to think about, well, first of all, do both. Don't just wait till the end. Definitely evaluate as you go, but do keep in mind that these have somewhat different goals and perspectives. And of course, iterate. I put this picture up because it has lots of arrows. The point is, you always want to go back and iterate. Everything you learn can then feed into the previous one. In that nested model paper, I didn't actually draw in all the arrows, leading some people to think that I was advocating the waterfall model. No, do not waterfall. Always iterate, not just for design studies. I just happened to steal this figure from this paper. So, taking a minute to step back, what are some of the victories and challenges that I see in terms of what have we succeeded at and what is left to do? So, I think one victory is that the user studies have gotten a lot more sophisticated. And there's been some interesting pendulum swings in the field. So first of all, we come a long way. If you look way back, there were no user studies at all. That was a Chi thing. We were not Chi, we were our own thing. And then gradually we started getting this idea that, oh, maybe we should do user studies. And the first few, of course, were perhaps not the strongest in the whole entire world, but at least they were first steps. And then gradually we started getting more and more methodologically sound work that was actually published here. And by now, I think we're in a very nice situation where we do have a lot of studies that are done with a really nice amount of rigor. So we're in a very good place with that. But in order to get there, there had to be a lot of vocal advocacy of more user studies to give them a place at the table. So arguably the question is, have we overshot? Have we had this culture change of emphasizing them so much that maybe there's too much emphasis on them? And I think the answer is, well, at least sometimes. Just personal communication over the last couple months, I've heard from a number of people who have submitted algorithm papers that have had them shot down from reviewers that said you should do a user study. Now, I would argue that that's in many cases probably the wrong way to go. That if you're trying to talk about a new technique, user studies are great. If you're really trying to say, I'm taking an existing technique and I'm building a better algorithm, then let's talk about things like system timings and benchmarks. So I think it's possible to have reviewers go a little too overboard. I definitely think that not all papers should have user studies. I also think it's possible that some people have kind of caught this enthusiasm and they think, great, I'll do a user study, but they're not really sure why they're doing it, or even more importantly, how to do it right. So instead of just ranting, let me say, what are some of the ways to do user studies right? What are some resources out there? So let's see. First, we'll check with Lewis Carroll. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So let's think about what road is the right road. So I have two pieces of advice, and one is that there's a lot of ways to do it wrong that are particularly tricky, because when you read the paper about a user study, the focus is on things like the statistical analysis, and there's this very brief, and they talk some about the experimental design, and there'll be like a paragraph about piloting. But of course, when you actually do a user study, it turns out that the experiment design, and particularly the piloting, is the part that takes an enormous amount of time to actually design it and get it right, and that's very hard to know when you're just reading the final product. So what I do recommend is collaborate with people who've done it before, ideally people with a background in HCI or cognitive psychology, and in particular, not just the first time, absolutely the first time, but ideally many, many times. I've actually collaborated with people for quite a long time before I stepped my toes into the waters of doing it more solo, because my own background came very much from an algorithmic computer graphics side rather than HCI. I kind of fell into doing experimental stuff because I just needed to know some answers. So I started out always doing system benchmarks, and then I started doing quantitative studies, and then I still didn't know enough answers, so I started doing qualitative studies, and who knows what I will do next, because answers are still always a thing to find. But one thing that did help is a few good resources. So if you are in a position, even if you're working with experts of wanting to know more about the methodology, two books that I recommend. One is by Andy Field. It's been out for a while, on how to design and report experiments, and it's great because he's snarky. So it is readable. It is not boring. There's all kinds of examples involving cats, which obviously makes everything better. The other is a brand new book from Helen Purchase. Many of you might know her from her work doing a lot of evaluation of graph drawing metrics. And she's written one for a general HCI audience, but a lot of the examples are straight out of the visualization papers that her own group has done. So that's another really nice resource. Actually, just going back to that slide for a moment, in fact, back to this one about the pendulum. No, where's my slide? There we go. The pendulum might have actually started swinging even back the other way. So I noticed that everyone in this panel has been dogpiling and saying, don't always do user studies. But let me just also swing back the other way and say, but do lots of them and do it right. And I don't want anyone to think that there's no place for user studies, because I think they're crucially and critically important for us as a field, particularly as we characterize what kinds of techniques and methods are good in what context. So, there's actually been already several fantastic user studies presented today. So I don't want this, be careful about when and how you use them, to be interpreted as a message for we don't need them, because we still absolutely do. So pendulums are tricky. We want them to stay right in the middle. What about the next Fixed-Range challenge? So what I'm very happy about is that we really, I think, are getting to a place of having a good state-of-the-art of doing significance testing with controlled experiments, where when that's the right method, we typically are doing it well as a field where we've got the right amount of power in the experiment and that kind of thing. So the good thing, the victory, is that we've moved beyond statements like, oh, my friends liked it, which is, I had the guy down the hall actually try it and it sort of worked, so clearly it's the right thing. So I think we've actually got a lot of, that's good. Great. So one interesting frontier beyond just significance testing is not for this thing, is it significant statistically, but if we have a lot of things, a lot of factors, what's the relationship between them? So can you actually start to unravel the relationship between multiple factors, not just is a single factor going to be significant? So there was this fantastic paper about 10 years ago by Colin Ware, Helen Purchase, and others that were really arguing for doing more regression, so more multiple regressions to compare factors. And they really called for a lot more papers in the VIS literature to do this, and there have been remarkably few. So that's an interesting frontier, is maybe we could do more multiple regression to untangle factors, not just significance testing. Another frontier, which is not quite so new, but I think still very important, is moving beyond time and error. And specifically to think more not just about kind of quantitative measurements of human time and error, but a lot more qualitative work. It's becoming more prevalent in the field, especially groups like Sheila Carpendale, Petra Eisenberg have done a lot with getting more qualitative work out there. Let me just mention that these are separable axes from whether it's a lab study or a field study in the wild. Either one of those could gather both qualitative and quantitative measurements. But there have been a fantastic series of workshops called Believe. They started at AVI, moved to CHI, and now have been at VIS, and there may well be another one in 2014. So that's a great place to talk about the methodology of beyond time and error. So then the third one, to wrap up, because I'm almost over time, is post-deployment studies are finally becoming commonplace, in part because a lot of people have been doing design studies where you really work with a group of users and you iteratively develop a system, and then what you do is you actually deploy it with the target users and see, is it helping them? So what's fantastic is we have a lot more of these post-deployment studies. So the interesting new frontier is beyond deployment to adoption. I think we need a lot more post-adoption studies. So Heidi Ram and folks did a great paper on the 7 scenarios, and they surveyed 800 papers in the literature, and they found that 5 of them had post-adoption studies. So a giant gap that we could do more on. Because the question is, what happens? So you work with your target users, and you deploy the system, and you have them use it for a few months, and they have some great insights and also speed up their work, and you write the paper, and it gets in, and then you never talk to the users again. And you don't actually know what happened. And if you go back a year from now, are they using it? Probably not. Do you know why? Probably not. So it'd be great to actually study as a field much more of what happens after you stop bugging the users with the weekly meetings. What happens? So to wrap up, of course you should evaluate your work. That's perhaps not a surprising statement. But I really argue that you should be careful to use the appropriate methods to evaluate, and that's the broad evaluation, not just the narrow one. But of course you should not have a user study in every paper. So what I want people to do is avoid this kind of litmus test of it's good if there's a user study, if and only if, and avoid this kind of cargo gut thinking, and instead think much more about what's the right method to evaluate, and think of it very broadly, where it goes all the way from system benchmarks to observational studies in the field with everything in between. Thanks.
Those were some great statements. So I'd like to now open up the floor to the audience for audience questions and comments. We'd like all audience questions and comments to be spoken through a microphone, which is being circulated around. So we're theoretically recording this, and we need to have everybody speak into the microphone. And before you speak, or at the beginning of your comment or question, perhaps you can state your name and lovely affiliation. First gentleman over there.
All right, Robert Cusera, Tableau Software. I'd like to tell a very brief anecdote and then actually ask a question. The anecdote is along the lines of which is evaluation is good, but it can also hurt you. So I reviewed a paper for IEEE VIS, I think last year or so. That was a really good paper, and I thought the idea was great, and I loved the first 2/3 of it. And then I got to the evaluation of it, and the evaluation was really problematic because it was bad. It was inconclusive. The write-up was bad. The authors obviously were not happy with it, and it almost killed the paper. And it got in the end, which is good because I think it's actually a really good idea. I'm really happy that this paper got published. But the evaluation, just feeling like you have to have one, almost killed that paper. So it can really backfire too. So that was the anecdote, and this is kind of the contra part. But the pro part is, I wanted to pick up on something that Min said about the difference between evaluation and empirical study. And I would like to rephrase that slightly. And I would like to say maybe there is a way to look at this as craft versus science. So perhaps the part about evaluation where it's all about, I made this thing and I can bang it against the wall and it still works, it's good. That's the craft part. So we can make something and we can show that it actually works. But then there's also the science part, the much deeper part where the studies come in that actually give us an insight into how things work, into how how perception works in this particular context of visualization, which is different than many other studies, and actually that's a different dimension to cognitive science. It's a different dimension to psychology than what most psychologists do. And I guess my question is, are we missing out here on actually producing more actual science by just not being nearly as rigorous and not having that cognitive science kind of conference or whatever that David was talking about for visualization, that could actually be a place where we could do that kind of thing and do a lot more depth of that than just essentially making it about evaluation of things that we already have.
That was a long question.
A little bit off of that, I think that, coming back to one thing that Min said, this question of, is evaluation the wrong paper type title? So, mea culpa, I think that a number of our paper type titles are perhaps imperfect, but I think evaluation is actually the one I regret the most. And the question is, when we say evaluation, what do we mean? Do we mean controlled user experiments? Do we also mean, say, field studies? Your suggestion was, what if we just called them empirical studies? But what's tricky is system benchmarks are also empirical studies. So are we actually trying to separate out the kind of evaluation of the computer system from the human-centered evaluation in any way? And do we need a word that says that more specifically? And then continuing on that, the difference between evaluation and, say, characterization. So I think, characterizing human response is a very wordy paper title, but maybe it's one that actually gets closer to this question of not just what's better, A or B, but how do humans interact with this thing? So, maybe characterizing humans is a better title than just evaluation, because kind of addressing both of what Robert and what Min said.
I'll add, I obviously agree with Robert that something like a science would be useful, and it's important to remember that a science, you're evaluating theories, and a science is supposed to be progressive. And so it's not enough to take off-the-shelf knowledge from psychologists, because unsurprisingly they haven't answered questions that arise from richly interactive visualization. It's never been posed to them. They don't have the technology to address them if they were. But when a science is progressive, its methods changed to be appropriate to the subject matter. They build on existing theory, and it's that kind of building that we're not able to do without something like a cyber psychology or a cognitive science of interaction design. And so it's that building that is going to be problematic. The methods that we're using have changed substantially from what you see in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, and they have because the technologies we're using are different. The environments are richer. You begin to use computational models or mathematical models more than statistical tests. So it really does, I think, require a change in the science, if not a new science.
Okay, why don't we take another question from the audience? Your name and affiliation, and then this gentleman afterwards.
Hi, I'm Vera Maslow from University of California, Santa Barbara. So I didn't start in visualization. I started with tracking information flow at the systems architecture level. And there was a lot of data, and designers would say, oh, if you could help me do this, that would be so cool. But those designers are not that many, especially my friends or collaborators, etc. They're not that many. So I'm having a hard time figuring out, how do I evaluate this within this community, which I see that sometimes there's usually 20, 100 of users. So I would appreciate some advice in terms of when is evaluation useful, how much, and when it's so domain specific.
So I have a partial answer to that, which is that what methods you use depend a lot on your goals. So I typically kind of split things into, I'm working with a relatively small set of people, and then what you're doing is not trying to do a controlled experiment with statistical significance. Instead, what you're doing is much more of a focus on a small set of people, and in this case, actually trying to say, how might this tool change their work practice is much more interesting than let me do a controlled experiment. So in that case, I think, saying, look, these 3 experts used it in detail, and here's the kinds of things they could do faster compared to what they could do before. You might say, well, that's n equals 3, but for this kind of goal, I think it's perfectly reasonable. So again, it's not that the only way to evaluate is statistical significance with a large group. The methods can depend on the goals.
Anyone else want to comment on that one? Okay. This gentleman has really been eager to ask us questions, so now's the time.
William Wong, Middlesex University. The question of when and how, I think, was quite interesting. One thing that was not raised today is the notion of this term prototype. We build a lot of prototype systems, but unfortunately with many people, that term has got very many different meanings, depending on how basic the prototype is and whether the prototype is actually the one before it actually reaches the industrial user. So there are terms that you can use in order to distinguish that. So the question earlier on, what kind of testing do you use, would highly dependent upon the maturity of the prototype. And NASA has a term called the TRL, so Technology Readiness Levels. So if you're talking about a very early technology, you may not want to do a field study. It's impossible to use it. Whereas if you have a technology that's about to be deployed on the space shuttle, then a field study would actually be very important for you to run, as well as other control studies. So it all depends very much also on the level of the particular technology. And that's something perhaps we want to be able to talk about. And whether you call it an empirical study, an evaluation, well, what you're really trying to do is to test whether the system actually works. And if you take an example, like a critical, let's say a training system, a virtual reality-based training system, there are many different aspects of that system you want to test. One is the training methodologies that you use in relation to the technology. Another one is whether the training system actually delivers results. And at a different level, can it be used easily in order to train and work with? And then at another level yet again is the technology working as a system, as a technical system. So when you're talking about evaluation, it's not just whether we run an empirical study, whether it's rigorous, whether it's significant or not. It all depends very much on the kind of technology you're building. And maybe some comments from you guys.
I guess one quick comment I would say is, first of all, if you're trying to define what TRL level you're at, it really depends who you're talking to, right? You know, and what should a university do? I've never really seen any of my colleagues who in DoD funding or et cetera will say they'll get beyond TRL level 5 or 6. But one of the issues is in doing that, when should you, as me as a researcher, what level do I have to have my technology ready to before I publish? If I'm going through that whole development cycle, is that a series of 10 publications that a given review pool will accept? Or do I have to be to a certain level before it's publishable? I mean, the guidelines, I think one of the issues we face with all of this is that we have a very diverse group of people reviewing it, and they all have different expectations, so what they're expecting to see in that type of evaluation, and knowing which is always appropriate for each given level, because we're bringing in so many different disciplines into this, becomes complicated.
Unfortunately, we have to calibrate ourselves as a community. And the other issue, I suppose, is like when Brian talked about his fish tank world and the experiment that he did with the little white disc moving around in that world. That is not a prototype, but it's publishable. So
Probably
it all depends on
not here.
not here.
Probably not publishable this week.
No. But the underlying concepts and the constructs that you're trying to assess and whether those constructs can actually be applied in a visualization system is highly usable.
And that sort of goes to a comment that reminds me of a comment I thought of when Tamara was doing her presentation about doing the task analysis part. The skill of being able to analyze how someone does a task is actually a complicated domain, and knowledge elicitation and cognitive task analysis are very complicated things. So as an academic in our field, should we be experts in all this, or should we have big collaborative groups on all projects? I mean, hopefully we think that collaboration and working with these people make a lot of sense to do instead of expecting us all to go back and get second degree, third or fourth degrees. But
There are many people interested.
I see we have I feel a lot of energy in this panel today, a lot of synergy.
Should people be in line, maybe?
Let's give Gordon a chance to ask his, I'm sure, amazing question.
Well, I created what was then an empty cube, but I know that other people were virtually cubed by having raised hands, so I don't want to spend too long. Thanks for the interesting discussion. It's made me think more about the space of evaluation and the kinds of things that can be ways of evaluating things. On one end, Tamara's been mentioning benchmarks. The metric there is speed, and somehow we just trust that there's this absolute benchmark metric of time, and that faster is better, because in so many cases, that's a good rule of thumb. On the other end, there are the kinds of things where you're doing cognitive psychology to study interaction of some algorithm, and it's the visualization produces with respect to human psychology, and that's very much inside the human brain and the human perceptual system and our cognitive systems. So I'm wondering if there's your thoughts on something that's in between, something that's an objective evaluation of the visualization that's not necessarily embedded in the perceptual psychology, some other kinds of heuristics for evaluating visualizations that are more about the visualization than merely how long it took to make, but less about the brain and the things which are messier and more application specific. Do you think there's space for that kind of middle ground in the evaluation, and what would that look like?
So I have a few thoughts on that already, because in the area of, for example, graph drawing and also, scatterplot evaluation, there's a lot of fields where people have proposed some quantitatively computable metrics. And then, of course, the question is, this metric that you can actually compute, that's some way to talk about image quality, does that match up in any, it's in some sense a proxy. And does the proxy match up with the want, which is this complicated, squishy internal brain state? And so I think there's this interesting question of trying to say, for a bunch of basically quality metric proxies, to what extent do they actually match up or not match up with human judgment? And that might be a nice way to try to bridge in between, so that we can say it's not just speed. It's also, to what extent do we believe that any of these proxies are actually good stand-ins? So I think that's one way to start going. I mean, I also think, riffing off both what you said and what William Wong said, this question of what are we even evaluating? Something way outside the nested model, like if there are these 4 boxes, the one way up here is hard things like behavior change. What if you build a tool and you're trying to say, does this visual encoding technique make sense to someone? But what you're really trying to do is have this tool get them to change behavior, like use less energy. That's an extremely hard thing. Maybe it's a long-term thing over decades. How do you try to evaluate that? So just 2 thoughts on that, but I think Min wants the mic.
Well, and I also want to say that we talk about the psychology being in the head. Distributed cognition perspective, you recognize that there's no privileged access to cognition from things you pull from memory or things that you see in the world. And so the dynamics of events in the world become tied to the dynamics, the temporal patterns of human cognition. So we're now beginning to look, it's the distributed cognition perspective, at how the interplay over time of perceptual events that we create in the worlds that we build and cognition happens. So it really is a much more distributed kind of approach, but the emphasis to some extent has to be in human psychology, because we know so much less about it.
If I could also comment on, there's a number of things we need to aware when come to consider the perception and the cognition. Is the first thing is cognitive science itself is a evolving science, and there are many things previously understood or considered to be understood that may not be true or correct in the future tense. And so we need actually, we are part of, in fact, when I was joined Oxford, they asked me, say, what do you think about the role of visualization? I said, visualization actually provides cognition, an excellent cognitive science and an excellent platform to study how human mind works, because 50% of our neuron apparently devote to the vision. So we actually have a big role in that way to play. And then same time, I also find cognitive scientists are extremely good in helping us to guiding us through almost every single empirical studies involving controlled user studies are always involving psychologists in the team, and they're very willing to help. But on the other hand, they were very unwilling to design the study for us. They always say, "I don't really know what you guys want to find out," and that is our job in the sense because we understand why the visualization may potentially work and may potentially help, and that is the way we still have to take the initiatives to lead this kind of discovery, in my view. And another thing is, even some of our findings may not be correct. It doesn't mean the visual design is wrong. And if you're looking jailbroke on the street, and the visualization, it takes long time to learn the visualization skill. All the common visualizations, such as time series and the pie chart, they at least 300 years old. And the parallel coordinates, 30 years old, roughly. And if you ask people in the industry and so on, nobody really likes that. And so it takes a lot of time to learn. So would you say, do a user study, you find a user don't really like parallel coordinates, you say, this is bad technology, let's reject the paper? No, of course not. And so we need to take that into consideration. Visualization literacy is not easy to accumulate. This is another direction as a community we should learn or work out how can we actually teach visualization in a more effective way. How can get sort of 50% of school kids know how to use parallel coordinates? And that is the challenging as a part of that.
Excellent point. Okay, let's take another question or comments.
Hello, my name is Ragad. I'm from the University of Kaiserslautern in Germany. So actually, I like the idea of having the post-evaluation process for the product. But I was just wondering, how can we implement this actually concept in an environment like the research environment, where you have limited resources and limited budget, and sometimes it's very difficult to collect expert people. So I mean, it gives more like trustful results to have this kind of evaluation. But because I did a lot of evaluation, I like to do the same evaluation again, but there is no other resources for that.
It's a good question.
If I could comment, there's another observation I noticed is, and everyone probably involving the control the user studies or evaluation, they actually probably realize it's a very expensive process, and that's in some way as a community we still are very, very small community. In fact, part of the problem of our community on the impact factor issue is because we are a small community and we don't have enough people to cite our papers. And if our community grow up like biology, we will be as good as nature, and in terms of publication. So there's an impact factor is related to the size of community. With a small community, one big problem is we don't have enough resources to do study for everything. And so if we spread a lot of energies on doing evaluation, which is useful, very, very useful, I'm not denying for that. That means actually we don't really have enough energy to tackle the big problems, which in this era of big data, and in my view, we actually have a lot of big problems to address. And
I was going to say, from some other fields, if you look at the health and nutrition fields, they study effects on cohorts for 10 or 20 years and get groups where they're talking thousands of people involved. And that's the funding model that the agencies in health support, and the way all the studies are designed. In our community, most of what we do aren't, most of the software there were papers on 2 or 3 years ago isn't currently being used by people today, right? Because we're sort of between the developing new techniques and the engineering-driven solution type of thing, and so you've got a spectrum. So it's very hard to do this effect of, are people using it 6 months from now? And depending on your solution, it can also be very hard to judge, have you made the person any more effective? Do they think it's made a difference? because in a lot of domains it's hard for people to judge how effective they are. Right? So it becomes a really becomes more subjective in designing those studies.
It's a very interesting topic, actually. Okay, let's take the next question.
Hi, Nick Diakopoulos, Columbia University. So it was suggested that you might evaluate originality, rigor, and significance of a piece of research. And I kind of wanted to push back a little bit on the significance dimension and ask whether or not that's really a business that we want to be in anymore. So historically, of course, we had constraints on how much space that we had for publishing papers. We don't have that constraint anymore. And so you see open access journals like PLOS One moving to a model where, yes, they evaluate originality and rigor, but they leave the significance part of that assessment up to the wider world and let the world decide if it's significant. So I just wanted to pose that as a provocation to the panel. Should we get out of the business of evaluating significance and get out of the way to let the world judge the significance?
If I could answer that, I guess it's a part of the sort of my talk, and it stimulates that particular part. And so first thing is, we like to encourage a particular effort to make things more significant. And in fact, one of the elements of survey work, and then usually outside of a particular paper, and they then independently survey paper usually achieve very significant and from various reasons, citations, and so on. They are really important kind of work. And in terms of individual work, when in the short term, what I try to say is it's very difficult to evaluate significance in the short term, and you can speculating. So in some way, I actually quite happy for some paper with a lot of originality or a lot of rigor, and you can actually speculate in the potential significance, and it doesn't always need to prove that. However, other paper, and such as application paper, and they may be quite capable, or system paper, they may be quite capable of demonstrating the significance. And the paper such as, for example, D3, and now we can see actually is get widely used, and even maybe at that time publisher wasn't significant. Now we know it's significant, and those are the impact we really need to take into account. So part of it, the reviewer's job, in my view, is to speculate and anticipate, to say that paper is going to create a significant impact, and rather than ask the author to prove it all the time, because otherwise, how could we have the paper like a marching cube, and they get cited by everyone, not just by us, by every other communities, and those are paper we really wanted in our community.
So let me also respond to that, because a few things came up both with what you said and with what Min said. I mean, this question of significance, even if you leave the reviewers out of it completely, I still think there's this issue that authors have finite lives, and so you want to actually make an impact and think, what can I do that would be the most significant in terms of effectiveness? So I still think authors should be thinking about significance, even if the reviewers fling themselves out of the loop for making that determination, because it's true that pages are no longer physically a constraint, but attention is absolutely a constraint. So I think that's one question. And then the other, to respond to what Min said, this question, so would marching cubes or tree maps get published today because they don't have an evaluation in them? But there's this crucial thing, which is that the territory changes. So super early work when there's absolutely nothing to compare against is always going to be a very different thing than much more mature work when there's all kinds of other things against which to compare. So, this question of would we publish marching cubes today? Well, but all the other things that have been published since then, of course you'd have to compare against, but I don't think that's a slam on today's reviewing. I think that's this issue of maturity. And it's always, that really early papers are a very different beast than papers 20 years later.
I'm not quite agree. Say, for example, tree map. You can very easily demand the tree map. People should do a user study against a tree visualization.
And actually characterizing that, for example, some kinds of tree visualizations are fantastic for things like path following, whereas tree maps are much more about attributes of the leaves. And so really they're addressing completely different abstract tasks. Even though they're both about trees, that would be a nice thing to talk about.
And I would add something, getting back to your question. I guess the question is, what is the role of the publication? What do you consider a transactions or conference proceedings? Is it to help you find material that has been distilled down and is considered of such a level that's worth your time? I mean, I can see the view of the more ideas that get out there, potentially the greater rate science will be advanced if people can view and pick out the best papers, or you could use a community-based view of how often are they read. But if there's 10 million papers published this year on visualization, how do I know everyone through given search engines, etc., isn't always drawn to this first group to find them? So, I mean, as the data gets large enough, you can never find the things that are the most significant, even if you get a distributed group to try to do it. So, I mean, to some extent, coming from sort of the former journal side and looking at the peer review process, I think part of it is to say that there is somewhat of a, this is what's considered most significant, right? And sort of putting this together so that it's worth someone's time. It's sort of an intelligent filter. But I also, there's a part of me that really likes your point of, you know, let's publish everything as long as it's rigorous and meets a certain quality level. And as people use it, we'll find out what's the most significant. It is. And surprisingly, even though we don't have pages now, there still ends up being a cost model with the number of papers, etc., because of editing and just time, you know, for all of this. But no, I do actually like, I mean, my view is, the best comment I ever heard on a decision at a papers committee meeting was on a borderline paper. If we publish a paper and we made the wrong decision, no one will cite it. If we don't publish it and we made the wrong decision, that's really hurting the field.
Good point. Very good point.
Okay.
Okay, we still have a few more minutes.
I have the microphone, so I got the word. Anyway, Klaus Müller, Stony Brook University. I really liked your comment about the visual literacy, Min. So it sort of reminded me a little bit on the Geico commercial, right? It's so simple, even a caveman can understand it, right? Like, you know, can you first test, I think Robert Kosara did some work on this, like the first test a user's visual literacy before testing more advanced things to actually gauge or normalize the test later on. Some people just don't get it, you know, they just can't, because they don't have this sort of visual literacy that another person may have from the ground up. So would you actually go and test that? Would you recommend that one first test that then sort of normalizes the scores a little bit? And secondly, would you go out to a school and actually test 50 school children if they understand power coordinates?
And I guess so the question is to me. So first thing is in psychology, and there were psychological experiments were based on this kind of divided the user into groups. And one particular talk I heard, in fact, in the US, was about to study people's the conduct study. Divided people into the image-based thinking or text-based thinking first, then they to work out how sort of a study will affect this. And in fact, those studies were particularly designed, anything was potentially considered to be not quite sure are you image-based or text-based. They actually eliminate those people from the subject team and say, no, you're not allowed to study further. And so they were study taking those into account as a part of the control parameter. In terms of that, and in terms of visualization literacy itself is a issue. In fact, we should take it into account. And I also find that some of the time you actually do the kind of a study evaluation with domain experts to judge whether a visual design works or not. Actually, part of the process is actually the education process from our side. We kind of have to teach or help the domain expert to learn how to visualize. And quite often, some of their design, most of us probably had a similar experience. When the visualization domain expert designed the visualization, say, could you do this, do that, quite often was based on their need for disseminating their knowledge to their students, and rather than for themselves to make observation of data. And one example, which is Rita just said beside you, when Rita worked with glaciology, ologists, and they keep saying we need the maps. We need the maps in the visualization. We do geography. We always need the map. But we actually work out with for 6 months. We notice they know the map inside and out. They don't need the map, and that is part of the things you have to work out, and throughout the nested model. In fact, as Tamara said, you keep going loops and eventually find out, and what's the best way to design.
Also, to riff off that, this question of what can you actually test people as a precondition and then try to figure out how to have a visualization that works? I think we're not there yet, and that's one of our holy grails. There's this whole literature, mostly in HCI, about these adaptive interfaces where you've got this idea of being able to say, here are some proxies for what the user knows that are good enough that we can actually then adapt the design to that. I would love to be there as a field, but I think the reason we don't see those kind of papers so much here is that we're maybe 10 to 15 years away. Because I think, things like the Shepherd mental rotation test, which is a very, very blunt instrument compared to this kind of visualization is going to be better for this person versus that. So I feel like as a field, we need to do a huge amount more characterization before we can be at a place where we know what very quick test to run on the user such that then we give them the right thing. So I'd love to be there. I just don't think it'll be anytime soon.
But we also need to understand that psychology tries to find a sort of generalized theory of mind. Individual difference is an error term. And so the fact that we work with highly specific subpopulations like air traffic controllers who develop different perceptual attentional ability really takes us off the map. I think in the history of science, there are new sciences like biophysics that get created because the methods that biologists are using aren't quite right and the methods that physicists are using aren't quite right, but they sort of have something that they can bring to the table. And there's really a need to kind of advance, a group of people who study that thing, like membrane biokinetic, transport kinetics.
Okay, I suggest we do say one more question and then two. Well, we have a time constraint, so we'll try one and then we'll make the decision after this one if we should have one more. Next question.
Okay. Thank you for the interesting talk. Here I have an interesting visualization of more than 200 tree visualization. It says there is more than 270 tree visualization so far. So, but we don't know yet which visualization is best or even which one is better than which one. So I have a very stupid suggestion for the system and I would like to get a comment about the system. There is a site like Many Eyes where user can upload the data set, and if we have say 200 tree visualization at that site, and if the site count every time when user uses one specific form of the tree visualization, we just count all of them, and after say 6 months, we found that this specific form of tree visualization is most used tree visualization or that kind of thing. So I think it will not solve every problem, but it can solve a little limited set of problem like post deploy study or mean change big evaluation kind of impact. So I would like to get feedback about that kind of thinking. Yes.
So we're just saying all the reasons we think that that isn't answering sort of the what's best, because it depends on the person, it depends on the task, it could be how much time they have in terms of which is effective. It could be that everyone was drawn to this one and they downloaded it and it didn't work, so then they went and explored different paths, and you don't have that information unless you're recording that. And it could be they tried using it and then never used it again, right? So it's showing popularity, it isn't necessarily showing that one's better, and I don't know that you can say one is always best. Just as Tamara was mentioning, in terms of a tree structure versus a tree map, it depends on what you're trying to investigate, right? Yeah.
All right.
Astrology is popular too, but
Yeah.
We'll do one more, and then I suggest we wrap up in this for keeping with the time schedule.
Okay, thanks. Steve Hurrows, Northwestern University. My question is if a new technique or new application paper, if there's a decision of whether or not it should be published, that doesn't have a user performance evaluation or an empirical study, does it not sort of create the risk that the only way that you can then publish the evaluation is if you then contradict the published results, and you can't really publish a study that says, yes, that thing that was already published does work? And what kind of, or should there be a community reprioritization, or should we allow those kinds of papers, or should we always say that when there's a new application, a new technique, that you should evaluate?
Well, I think this gets back to what David said about, is there some value in separating out the here's the new technique from the here's the evaluation? And obviously one reason is that sometimes if you invented the technique, then maybe you've got a bit of bias in showing that it's better than X, Y, and Z previous things. I mean, I think the answer is I'm not so concerned that you won't have a way to publish, because the simplistic answer of yes, it's better, that's never going to be the answer. It's always, I characterize this with respect to that. So with this kind of data and task, then look, here's a performance difference between technique, foo, and bar. And the giant combinatorics of data and task and user situation, not to mention even parameter tweaking and this and that, like, I think there will never be a lack of interesting things to find in terms of helping us characterize. I actually think the giant frontier for visualization is characterizing the universe of the things we've invented so far. Even if no one invented a new technique for the next 10 years, we'd be busy. And of course they will be inventing. So I think you want to mix. I think a certain amount of characterizing even within the first paper is at least helpful and helps fit things together, but it's never the final word. So I think I want to have my cake and eat it too, which is it's good to characterize as you go, but it also doesn't preclude later papers.
Okay, thanks.
Great. So I suggest we have one or two concluding remarks from the panelists and then wrap up the panel. It's been a very lively discussion, which I sort of thought it would be. That's why we organized this sort of panel. And I think we should keep talking about this when we're after the conclusion. So Min, do you have a concluding statement?
I think it's sort of an interesting discussion, and I certainly consider my comments about the evaluation is I'm still sort of like the idea we need to broaden the evaluation. We need to channel more energies to the discovering new knowledges and making more systems usable and spread the system, let the user make decisions and encourage more creativity, the originality, and so on. And I would like reviewers to consider themselves as a kind of a X factor to spot the talents and spot the potential of among the audience. Perhaps we shouldn't call them X factor, we should call them a Y factor, and that may be the way to look into how the review system should work.
Dave?
Well, I guess sort of going on that, I would say that I think there's lots of dimensions that we've talked about today of areas that we would like to see improvements, and I would actually encourage people when they're reading and reviewing papers to look, is this worthwhile for people to know on any one of those dimensions, and look at what's good among this multi-dimensional space instead of what's missing or what isn't quite there. Because the more positive work we get in this area, which is great and leads to discussions that have come up over multiple times, probably through multiple science domains. Should we have a journal of negative results that would actually help our field advance further quicker, because everyone wouldn't be duplicating all of the negative results that never get published. So, but I think that would be a little hard to get through the publications board within our societies. But the good news is that societies never get rid of a publication. So once we get it in there, it'll be there forever. So.
Right.
Well, it's an interesting discussion, and obviously one that will continue long after this session. I think back when visual analytics was defined as a science of analytical reasoning facilitated by interactive visual interfaces, I don't know that we realized just how much we were biting off with that statement. You know, is that science going to include a scientific method? Is it, you know, how much of a science, where are the boundaries of vast, and when will another science need to take it up? One interesting thing that I've been thinking about is actually we're in the business of producing science tools that advance science in areas like SciViz. Is there a way that we can use that to our advantage as we try to invent our own science?
Tamara.
I think my final conclusion is there's huge amounts of work to be done, no matter what your definition of evaluation, whether it's broad or narrow, there's vast amounts left to do. And that maybe I would encourage a lot of people to think, beyond evaluate, to characterize, to try to figure out can you characterize the performance of your system? Can you characterize the relationship between what you've done and the previous work? And there's just an enormous amount left to do. And that almost any way you tackle it, you're going to find something interesting. A Chi panel a few years ago was arguing that, in fact, Ed Shee said every single time they tried to replicate even their own previous work, they got a different answer. And so you could get at least 4 papers out of just this question of, can you even replicate your own work? So I think we need a huge amount more replication and trying to actually understand. So vast amounts left to do, no pun intended.
Let's thank our panelists. Thank you very much for attending the panel, and I look very much forward to seeing you all at EuroVis 2014 in Swazi, Wales.